They say blood is thicker than water, but for my parents, blood was just an annoying obstacle on the way to their capital. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? I felt it at 3 a.m. on an ER gurney. While I was fighting for every breath, my father was calculating how much he'd gain if I didn't wake up. This is the story of how I stopped being a victim and became their worst legal nightmare. My name is Audrey, and I am 26 years old. I used to believe that family was synonymous with unconditional love. That belief shattered at 3:15 in the morning under the hum of fluorescent lights in a Denver emergency room. I was strapped to a gurney, my world reduced to the metallic scent of blood and the blinding white of the ceiling following a devastating collision. Every breath was a jagged blade in my chest. The surgeon explained I had internal bleeding and needed immediate surgery, but there was a complication. Because of a severe reaction to anesthesia I'd had as a child, they needed to follow a specific, high-risk protocol. Hospital policy was rigid. They required family consent before they could proceed. My hands shook so violently I could barely navigate my phone. I called my parents, Richard and Diane. Voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I left messages that evolved from frantic to sobbing. An hour ticked by, each second a pulse of agony. Finally, my screen lit up. It was a text from my father. Can't this wait? We're in the middle of a closing with major clients. We're busy. Busy. I stared at the words until they blurred. My father was telling me to put my survival on hold because he was in a meeting. I broke. A racking sob tore through me, making my fractured ribs scream. The physical pain was nothing compared to the sudden, freezing realization of how truly alone I was. A nurse named Caleb and a social worker, Sarah, were by my side in an instant. Sarah leaned in, her voice a soft anchor. Audrey, is there anyone else? Any other relative we can reach? Through the haze of tears, I gave them the only other number I knew by heart. My grandfather, Arthur. My mother's father. Sarah stepped out to make the call. When she returned a few minutes later, her expression had softened. He's on his way, she said. He told me he'd be here in less than an hour. Arthur lived nearly 60 miles away, up in the foothills. But true to his word, less than an hour later, he came charging through the double doors. He was 74, a retired cabinet maker who still smelled faintly of cedar and wood glue. He wore an old flannel shirt with a smudge of sawdust on the cuff. He came straight to my bed, his weathered, calloused hands enveloping mine. "Oh, little bird," he whispered. That one phrase held more genuine affection than I had received in a lifetime. He listened to the doctor with a sharp, focused intensity, asking practical questions about the risks and the recovery. Then, with a steady hand, he took the clipboard and signed the consent forms. As they began to wheel me toward the operating room, he leaned down and kissed my forehead. "I'll be right here when you wake up, kiddo. Don't you worry about a thing." When I finally drifted back to consciousness hours later, groggy and heavy-limbed, the first thing I saw was his familiar silhouette in the chair beside me. He hadn't moved. His silver hair was a mess, and he was working through a crossword puzzle in the dim light, but he was there. Seeing him, my protector, unlocked a floodgate of memories. It was a lifetime of emotional neglect suddenly compressed into one sharp, painful point. My parents were prominent wealth managers in Boulder. They lived in a glass and steel house that looked like a museum exhibit, valuing only what could be appraised and insured. I remembered their faces when I told them I was taking a job at a local refugee outreach center. "That's nice, dear," my mother had said, her smile as tight as a surgical stitch. But it doesn't exactly pay the bills, does it? My father had been even more blunt. When I showed him my first car, a reliable, used Honda Civic with a few dents, he simply sighed. When are you going to get serious, Audrey? This is exactly why you should have stayed in finance. But Arthur was different. When my parents skipped my college graduation for a pivotal networking retreat in the Caymans, Arthur was there. He sat in the drizzling rain, beaming, holding a bouquet of wild daisies. He was the person who taught me how to use a lathe, how to feel the grain of the wood, and how to find beauty in the making. Anything made with heart is worth more than a mountain of gold, he'd always say. He was the one who showed up. He was always the only one who showed up. And now, in the most terrifying moment of my life, he was the only one here again. For days after my surgery, my parents finally made an appearance. They didn't walk into the room with concern. They arrived with an air of profound inconvenience. Richard was already scrolling through his phone before he reached the bed. Diane handed me a small bag of generic hard candy, the kind you find at a gas station checkout. Well, you look better, my mother said, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for an exit. The parking at this hospital is just atrocious. We had to circle the block for 20 minutes, my father complained, pacing near the window. Audrey, what's the timeline here? When do the doctors think you can get back to your desk? Not are you hurting? Not a what did the surgeon say? Just a when can you be productive again? They stayed for exactly 35 minutes. In that time, my mother complained about a difficult client, and my father checked his watch 3 times. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, the silence they left was louder and more painful than their empty chatter. Your apartment is on the 2nd floor, isn't it? The doctor asked, looking over his spectacles at my chart. I nodded. With your leg and shoulder in this condition, you won't be able to manage stairs for at least 6 weeks. A wave of panic surged through me. I had nowhere to go. My parents' minimalist, ultramodern condo in Boulder was famously not set up for guests, a polite way of saying they didn't want anyone disrupting their aesthetic. But before I could spiral into the logistics of my own displacement, a firm, familiar voice cut through the room from the chair in the corner. She's coming home with me, Arthur said. He had been there every single day. He explained to the medical team that he was retired, his house was a single-level ranch, and he had already spent the morning building a temporary wooden ramp for the front porch. Just like that, it was settled. Moving into his small, well-kept home felt like breathing clean air for the first time in years. He settled me into the guest room, prepared meals from scratch, and sat with me for hours while I endured the grueling physical therapy sessions. But in the quiet of the night, I wrestled with a shame I couldn't quite name. Why, after everything they had done, did I still check my phone hoping for text from them? Why did that insulting 35-minute hospital visit still feel like something I had craved? I remembered a concept from a psychology elective back in college: learned helplessness. It's what happens when you are trapped in a negative environment for so long that your brain simply stops looking for the exit. You learn to accept the pain as your baseline. For 26 years, I had been conditioned to accept their neglect. A child who receives validation only once in a blue moon learns to treat those tiny, worthless crumbs as a feast. I wasn't weak, I was trained. But lying there in Arthur's quiet home, surrounded by genuine care, I realized the training was finally over. As my body began to mend, the administrative nightmare took over. My neighbor, Beth, a kind-hearted preschool teacher from the unit below mine, brought over a massive, overflowing box of mail. I didn't want to bother you while you were recovering, she said, her eyes full of sympathy. It just kept piling up. I thanked her and sat at Arthur's kitchen table, facing the mountain of envelopes. At first, it was just the usual, terrifying medical bills and insurance statements. But then, I found something that didn't fit. Confusing letters from my disability insurance provider and my private investment firm. I called the insurance company first. After 20 minutes of hold music, a representative finally answered. I explained that I was trying to sort out my claim. There was a long, heavy pause. The representative said slowly. We've already been in communication with your financial proxies regarding this account. A chill ran through me, cold as mountain water. My what? Who? Your parents. Richard and Diane. They contacted us 3 days after your accident. They were inquiring about the protocol for liquidating the entire fund. Liquidating. Not accessing for my care. Liquidating. My mind flashed back 2 years. I was sitting in my father's glass-walled office. He had insisted on helping me set up my first real portfolio and my supplemental disability insurance. It's just standard procedure, Audrey, he'd said, sliding a pen across the mahogany desk. We'll just add your mother and me as financial proxies. It makes it easier to manage everything under the family umbrella. I had been grateful then, thinking he was finally taking an interest in my future. Now, I saw it for what it was, a trap. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness. It was a cold, clinical fury. I hung up and immediately dialed my father. He answered on the second ring, his voice breezy and professional. Audrey. We were just wondering when you'd check in. Why did you try to liquidate my disability fund? The silence on the other end was absolute. Now, Audrey, he finally said, his tone shifting into the condescending lilt he used for difficult clients. Listen, the market is volatile. It's a bad time. We were simply looking to restructure your assets. To move that money before it lost more value. Move it where, Dad? I pressed, my voice dangerously quiet. It's just a simple restructure. Move it where? I repeated. Move it where, Dad? He snapped. The polished veneer finally cracked, and the raw frustration underneath poured out. The firm is having some cash flow issues, if you must know. It's a temporary loan. You'll get it back. Don't be so dramatic. A temporary loan. He was planning to use the money I needed to survive, the funds meant to keep me afloat while I was unable to work, to plug a hole in his sinking business. This wasn't neglect. This was theft. I hung up. But the cold realization was only beginning. It wasn't just the disability fund. I went back to the pile of mail Beth had brought. My hands sorted through the hospital bills and the insurance notices until I found it, an official-looking envelope from a bank I didn't even have an account with. I tore it open. It was a rejection letter, but not for a credit card. It was a notice declining an application for a home equity line of credit. The address listed on the application was my condo. My father had co-signed for my place 2 years ago. I hadn't had enough credit history on my own, and he had insisted on helping. It's just a formality, Audrey, he'd said back then. Just to get you started. He had used that formality to try and drain the equity from my home. The application date was 2 days after my accident. While I was lying in the ICU, fighting for my life, he wasn't just trying to liquidate my savings. He was actively trying to leverage my roof to save his failing reputation. All the sadness I'd felt in the hospital, that heavy, suffocating helplessness, evaporated. It was replaced by something sharp, cold, and crystalline. This wasn't a family dispute. This was predation. They were circling my life like vultures, waiting for me to be weak enough so they could pick me apart. I didn't cry this time. I looked up at Arthur, who was watching me from the doorway, his face etched with worry. I didn't have to say a word. I just handed him the letter. He read it, his expression growing thunderous. He stared at the page for a long, silent minute. Then he put the letter down, walked into his small study, and returned holding an old, cracked leather address book. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing a list of names until he found what he was looking for. He picked up the landline phone on the wall and dialed from memory. "Elias," he said into the receiver. "It's Arthur." "Yes, it's been a long time." "I'm well, but I'm calling about my granddaughter. She's in trouble." He listened for a moment, then held the phone out to me. "Mr. Miller will talk to you now." I took the phone. Elias Miller, a lawyer my grandfather had known for 40 years, listened patiently as I explained everything. My voice was steady and cold. I told him about the hospital, the text, the 35-minute visit, and then I detailed the disability fund and the home equity application. There was a long silence on the other end. "Audrey," he finally said, his voice calm and grave. "What your parents have done isn't just unethical, it is potentially fraudulent. They used their position of trust to gain access and attempted to act on it without your consent while you were incapacitated. We can fix this, and we can fix it now." "What do we do?" I asked. "You rest, and you heal," he said, and I could hear the scratch of a pen on a legal pad. "I'm going to draft a full revocation of power of attorney, a cease and desist notification for both of them, and new documents naming your grandfather as your sole medical and financial proxy. I'll have them ready by tomorrow." When I hung up, the betrayal still stung, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of power. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was a legal battle, and I was finally ready to fight. For weeks to the day after my accident, I called my parents and asked them to come to Arthur's house. I was off the heavy painkillers, my mind was clear, and I was steady on a pair of crutches. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon, looking visibly annoyed. My father walked in first, not even glancing at me. "Audrey, this is very inconvenient. We have a showing at 3. Whatever this is about, can we make it quick?" He stopped short when he saw the arrangement in the living room. I was sitting in a high-backed armchair, my injured leg propped up. On one side of me sat Arthur, his hands folded calmly in his lap. On the other side sat Elias Miller in a sharp charcoal suit, holding a briefcase. My mother saw him, and her practiced, professional smile faltered. What is going on? Who is this?" "Please, sit down," I said. My voice was even, and it surprised me how much weight it carried. They sat on the sofa opposite me, looking like strangers in Arthur's warm, lived-in home. I reached for a simple manila envelope on the coffee table and slid it toward them. My father scoffed. "What's this? More medical bills?" "These," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "are legal documents." "These are legal documents," I said, meeting my father's gaze. "They represent a full revocation of any and all power of attorney you hold over me, both medical and financial. They are cease and desist notifications, and they are the formal papers removing you as proxies and beneficiaries from every one of my accounts and insurance policies. Effective immediately." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a performative hurt. "Audrey, No. How could you? After everything we've done for you. My father's face turned a deep, blotchy red. The mask of the successful wealth manager finally disintegrated. Ungrateful, he spat, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped harshly against the hardwood. This is how you repay us? We were trying to protect your assets. The word protect hung in the air, so distorted it made my stomach turn. I looked at him, not with the heat of his anger, but with a cold, quiet finality. Protect them? I asked. Or liquidate them? Like the way you applied for a home equity loan on my condo while I was still in the operating room? The room went deathly silent. My mother's sobbing stopped instantly. She just stared at me, her mouth hanging open. Elias Miller and Arthur didn't move a muscle. My father's face went pale, the rage replaced by the hollow shock of a man who had never imagined he would be held accountable. He sat back down, the air seemingly leaking out of him. You don't know the pressure we're under, my mother finally whispered, her voice trembling. The firm is. I know, I said, cutting her off. But your failing career isn't my problem. Not anymore. Sign the papers. We are often taught that blood is thicker than water, that family is an unbreakable bond. But that is a weapon toxic people use to keep you trapped. They count on your guilt. They rely on the fact that you will keep setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. Sometimes, letting go of those ties isn't an act of betrayal, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It isn't about finding hate, it's about finally choosing to find yourself. It's the moment you stop being a victim and start being your own rescuer. My father, his hands shaking with a suppressed fury, snatched a pen from his jacket and scrawled his name across the documents. My mother followed, her tears staining the crisp white paper. They left without another word. My father didn't even look back. The door clicked shut, and the silence in Arthur's living room was absolute. I let out a breath I felt I'd been holding for 26 years. The weeks that followed were about rebuilding, not just my body, but my entire life. With Elias Miller's help, I secured my finances. I set up new accounts at a different bank, changed every password, and placed fraud alerts on my credit. I sold the condo. I couldn't stand the thought of living in a place my father saw as nothing more than an asset to be stripped. Instead, I found a small, bright apartment on the ground floor with wide doorways and a small patio. Arthur came over and built a sturdy wooden ramp for the entrance. Just until you're steady on your feet, he said. But I knew he built it to last. I returned to my work at the refugee center, but I was no longer the same person. The experience had forged something new in me. I used what I had learned, the legal loopholes, the insurance nightmares, the vulnerability of being a patient, and I pitched a new initiative to my director. We started a program that provides free legal and financial advocacy for survivors of major medical events, protecting them from the very kind of predatory exploitation I had survived. My life is quiet now, but it is full. Last night, I hosted dinner in my new home. My chosen family was all there. Arthur was teaching Caleb, the nurse who had stayed by my side that first night, how to play a complicated card game. My neighbor Beth brought a peach cobbler. We ate, we laughed, and I looked around at the hand-painted ceramic bowls I had made, now full of food and shared with people who actually cared. I realized then that I was finally whole. If you are listening to this and you are one of those people who has always felt like you were on the fringes of your own family, I want you to hear this. You are not defined by the love you didn't receive. Your worth is not determined by their inability to see you. You are not a supporting character in their story. You are the lead in yours. Building a family is not about blood. It's about who shows up. It's about who listens, who respects you, and who protects you. It's about the person who sits with you in the dark when you are broken, and then helps you build a ramp back into the light. Don't be afraid to let go of what is hurting you. Don't be afraid to choose yourself. Your real family is waiting to catch you.